The new project is called the Sewn board binding. This structure was developed by Gary Frost in the mid-80s, and it's called the Sewn board binding because the boards are attached to the text block just like the sections are. It's sewn on. And this is possible because the boards are made of a folded piece of card that's then filled in with a light board. So I'm going to pull the board out now. It hasn't been glued in yet. And in the center of that folded piece of card is the sewing that attaches the board to the text block. My current plan is to do a series of 3 videos. In this first video, I will demonstrate 2 ways of producing the text block, mainly 2 different sewing approaches, and then the subsequent 2 videos will each show 2 different covering styles. There's quite a bit of background information for this binding structure and a few people that I want to acknowledge, and I'll do that during the sewing sequence. Before we get started on construction, I'd just like to mention a few other features that have become associated with this binding style, as well as the board that is sewn to the text block. The text is flush to the boards, so there's no square. The most common spine attachment is this breakaway spine, though a tight back spine is possible, and I will demonstrate that as well. Another feature that goes back to the historical roots of this binding is the drummed construction. So a lot of the materials, such as the covering paper or even the paste down, are drummed on or just attached at the periphery, sometimes even at only one edge. But let's get started. So here's the materials I'm going to be using. I'll use some scrap manila, some 110 GSM paper, some 1mm board, some 0.3mm manila card. This is all cut to A5 size short grain, some paste papers for the end papers, and some medium weight Japanese paper to line the spine. We'll get started by folding 6 sections. So we don't want a lot of swell in this structure. So I'm using thicker paper, so it's 110 GSM cartridge paper, and I'll use a fairly thin thread, 25/3 linen thread. I'll do 6 sections, 4 sheets per section, and then I'll fold 2 pieces of manila card per book, the 2 end papers per book, and then 2 pieces of 1mm board, which is already cut to the right size to fit inside the folded manila card to make up the boards. And yes, I'm folding enough material for 2 text blocks. When I fold the manila card, I'm not going to use the bone folder on the crease because I want the crease to mold around the board, so I don't want a really sharp crease on the manila card. As always, the grain direction is head to tail or vertical. Once I've got the materials for the 2 books folded, then I will tip on the end papers to the first and last sections. The first sewing style I'll demonstrate is often called French sewing or link sewing. It's often used for small books that aren't sewn on supports, or it's used on very large books that need extra support. So I'm going to mark up a punching template for punching the holes. So I've marked the kettle stitches in 10 millimeters from the head and 12 for the tail for a bit of extra trimming room, and then I will have 2 sewing locations for the link stitches, which I did them equal distance apart and 12 millimeters wide. So I'll go through and punch all the sections and the boards. I'll mark the head. Since I'm using a thin thread, I'm using a thinner awl to punch the holes. This style of sewing is by far and away the most common that's used for the sewn board binding. The other way I'll demonstrate is using a link stitch similar to in the Coptic sewn journals, though you can use any type of link stitch that you want. I'll use the commonly used one because it's easy to do and it produces a good result. It gives nice even tension in the sewing without having too much of a lump on the spine. But when I do that, I will also discuss the other options for the link stitch. So starting with the manila card, we'll sew everything up in the technique which I've used in a number of videos now, so I'm not going to describe it too much, though you'll be able to see it in a moment. It's fairly straightforward. You just catch up the sewing on the previous section. Now this structure has become a very popular one, and as I mentioned, it was developed by Gary Frost in the 80s. Now I have a 2-page article by Gary Frost called The Sewn Boards Binding, which has all the details for what I'm going to demonstrate in this video series. Everything that I'm going to do is mentioned in this article. However, since then he's written longer articles. There's the application of sewn board technique to book conservation practice, and there was an article for the Guild of Bookworkers, which is significantly longer as well. And in addition to that, many other people have written blogs and articles about this structure. But one that I should mention in particular is Karen Hanmer's. So Karen did a Guild of Bookworkers Standards of Excellence video, which I paid full money for a few years ago. And that's actually where I learnt about this binding structure from, or learned how to do it properly. And so a lot of credit goes to Karen and her notes. Now, a lot of the smaller details I probably wouldn't have picked up from Gary's article, and I got from Karen's video. Now, Karen's video is 2.5 hours long, and she also covers another binding structure called the drum leaf binding, and I'm not going to touch on that at all, and I have no plans of doing a video on that. So I highly recommend that if you like this structure and want to learn more about it, that you watch Karen's video as well. As always, I'll have links to the articles and videos in the description. And the last person I want to mention is Ed. Ed provides really good feedback on my videos, and Ed has been suggesting that I do this video for a long time, and he's absolutely correct. It's perfect for my channel and it's long overdue. So thanks, Ed, for the encouragement and pushing to get this done. And while I'm talking about comments from people that watch my videos, I just want to assure everyone that I read all the comments and I try and answer all the questions. However, I am reaching a point where I get so many comments that I do occasionally lose track, especially for older videos. So if you don't hear back from me, please give me a reminder that I haven't responded to your comment or question. I don't mean to. I'm sure I've seen it, and it's just dropped down below the fold, and I've lost track of it. And occasionally I have issues with YouTube. It's fairly rare, but in the last week there was 3 days where I wasn't able to respond to comments. So if there is a bit of a delay me getting back to you, it's either because I'm swamped or YouTube's having some issues. Something I forgot to do on the first piece of manila card was to mold it around the 1mm board. This just helps eliminate any gap at the fold. You can do it after it's sewn on, it's just easier to do it before sewing it on. One of the features of this style of binding that Gary Frost really emphasizes is the minimal use of adhesive. So instead of gluing out entire pages, usually, or always actually, things are just adhered along the edges. To the extent that in his early models, Gary Frost recommended using a two-sided adhesive instead of PVA, for instance, and I'll be using PVA. So the next step is to glue this grey board into the manila card, and following what I just said, we're only going to do it right in at the fold. Now, of course, the sewing is sort of in the way, so this is an optional refinement, but you can take a tiny little bit off the edge of the board, but leave it at the head and the tail. Just a 0.5 millimeter slither, and that makes enough space for the sewing thread so that the board goes all the way to the back at the head and tail. So just apply adhesive along the fold and a little bit at the head and tail just to close up that part that's going to be exposed. This minimal use of adhesive even applies to the board covering material. And what we'll do is we'll turn the turn-ins around the edges of the boards and then glue on the inside of the turn-ins. And that's a technique known as drumming on, which gives the books a nice soft feel, sort of a pillowed feel. Okay, we'll put the text block between some boards and put it in the press, low enough down to consolidate the sewing, but we don't want to push it together too hard. I'll just measure the width of the book with a pair of dividers, and then we'll glue up the spine with PVA. Once I've put the first layer of PVA down, I'll use the dividers to cut a strip of Japanese paper, the same width as the spine, or ever so slightly wider. It doesn't really matter if it's a bit wider because you can wrap it around the edges, and then we'll glue that to line the spine. When I put this lining on the spine, I'm going to use a trick that I learned from Karen's video, and that's to use a Japanese technique which is often used for laminating papers, and that's to use a stiff bristled brush to stipple the spine lining down onto the spine, which will it helps with making sure the adhesive doesn't get forced out and the paper gets contoured into the spine grooves and bumps and whatnot. So that works really nicely. I used an old paste brush that's gone a bit stiff, which is perfect. Karen uses a stencil brush. That's the first text block done. Now we'll move on to the second one, where I'll use a different sewing technique. I'll start by remembering to mould the manila card around the 1mm board. Now this link stitch is shown in a diagram in the original Sewn board binding article by Gary Frost, and Karen demonstrates it as well, but it's not normally mentioned in articles about the style of binding. It's fairly straightforward. It's the same as the sewing of a Coptic sewn journal. I'll use 4 link stitch locations, so I just made a template and equally spaced those locations. I'll be using the same smaller awl or thinner awl, and I'll punch the holes in the same manner. I was asked recently why I don't use a punching cradle, and I just find them a bit slow and fiddly and much prefer this technique. However, someone else also mentioned they're having trouble getting the holes to go right through the fold, and I think the trick is to, when you put that punching template into the fold, to push it in to consolidate the section and to push the awl in at 45 degrees, and I never have a problem with it. It may take a bit of practice. So as I said, I'm using this same link stitch that is commonly used for these Coptic sewn journals. It's just the board attachment is a bit different. So the startup pattern involves the folded card and the first section, and this is documented in the article Application of Sewn Board Technique to Book Conservation Practice, and it's credited to Carlo Mori. So you go sew all along except alternating between the manila card and the first section. So you go up and down and then repeat the pattern going back, but in a mirror image, so you fill in the gaps on the way back. The result is a continuous line of thread inside the card and inside the first section, and thread in both directions at each of the link stitch locations. At this point, it's easier to swap to a curved needle. I'm going to use a John James mattress needle, and you can buy these directly from John James, and they come in these cool little hand folded packets. Now I'll demonstrate the most common way of doing this link stitch, which is to go back in the opposite direction to the direction that you're sewing. And the reason I think that this is the most common is that it is strong, it holds the tension on the thread, and it's not prone to ripping the paper in the fold. Now, the other method that you can use is to do the link in the same direction that you're sewing, but it is more prone to tearing the paper at the fold. However, the advantage is that you don't get as much of a lump on the spine. So if you're after a smoother spine, then you might consider using that link stitch instead. The most common way to cover the spine is this breakaway spine covering. However, you can do a tight back covering, so a covering that is glued to the spine, and thus why you may want a smoother spine. Now in this case, I'm not going to take out the 0.5 millimeter along the edge of the grey board, and you'll see that there's no noticeable gap visible at the head and the tail. Once I've done this, I'll move on to lining the spine with the piece of medium weight Japanese paper. Now, because of the breakaway spine that most people use for this binding structure, you can see the spine. Now that can be a feature. You can see the link stitches, and they can look quite interesting. And the other thing you can do is to color match the spine and potentially the sides of the boards to the cover material. So you may want to get some strong paper, handmade paper, that's the color of your covering material or some matching color, and make that wider than the spine so that it extends over the spine by 1 or 2 centimeters, or whatever the amount the breakaway is going to be. And you'll understand that more when we go to do the covering videos. So I think that covers the 2 most common construction methods for the text block for the sewn board binding, which is take those off to the guillotine and trim up the 4-edge head and tail. And then next week we'll move on to doing a couple of different covering techniques, and then if I'm still in the mood, I'll do another video on a couple more covering techniques. So I hope you've enjoyed the video so far. As always, I really appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button. If you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button. And until next time, cheerio.